Good afternoon, and welcome to the third in our series of webinars for Interfaith Scholar 2022. We're here to celebrate the phenomenon of Sabbath economics, how ancient wisdom could guide us for our modern crises. We're in the third presentation, which is entitled Facing Ecological Ultimatums, Recovering from Public Addictions. It's my privilege as the chair of the Interfaith Scholar Weekend, Jim Grant, to welcome you back if you've not been here yet. And I wish all of you who are here at this third presentation to please enter into the chat box your name, your affiliation, so that our speakers, Professor Elaine Enns and Ched Myers, would be able to get a reminder of just who is our community. Basically, this Interfaith Scholar Weekend includes people from all the different faiths that are in the Valley. That would be Islam and Judaism and Sikhism and Buddhism and Hinduism, Unitarian Universalism, all forms of Christian life, and many other academic and institutional commitments that people have towards scholarship and social justice. So we're so privileged to have with us today two scholar practitioners who have been spending 3 decades and more committed to the work that we are doing here in the Valley. And they are preparing us with these presentations and our discussion with tools for really committing to what is the work of creating a new economy, of creating a new understanding of community. So thank you for being here, letting them know who you are. And on that note, I'm just going to remind you that there are certain groups I didn't mention today in our coalition, such as the Alumni Association at Fresno State University, especially the Ethics Center, which was very present last night, which is also present today through Evany Gonzalez Burgos, the Human Rights Coalition, the Sikh Council of Central California, and especially Temple Beth Israel. And that brings up our person who will share with us the land acknowledgement. I'd like to introduce now Rabbi Laura, who happens to be not only a friend, but a person who is representing the commitment that she has to social justice through her own commitment to Tikkun Olam. She's a member of our interfaith community, and she is a professor at the Clinical Education for the Rhea Hirsch School of Education at Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Institute of Religion in LA. Her work includes, among other things there, mentoring students, coordinating fieldwork internships, and teaching graduate level courses in pedagogy and organizational change to students who are studying either to become Jewish educational leaders or even, and perhaps, rabbis like herself and her husband, Rabbi Rick Weiner. Rabbi Laura, Rabbi Dr. Laura, thank you for being here. And would you please bless us and remind us the land on which we are standing here in Fresno County, to whom it really belongs.
Thank you very much, Jim, and Ched and Elaine and everybody else who is creating this weekend for us. I want to give honor to the land on which we sit. I sit on the land of the Yokut and the Miwok and the Mono and the Chukchansi, and I honor them for their fortitude and for the gifts of the land that we live on. I also want to name the land of my ancestors, the land of Ukraine, where my ancestors, my most recent ancestors, my great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents lived. And that land is sadly in a place of pain, and those people are in a place of pain right now. And I pray for the peace and restoration of that sovereignty and that land. And as has been noted in our sessions, this is the year of the Shemitah in the Jewish community, which we observe every 7 years. And so I also pray for the land of my very, very, very distant ancestors, the land of ancient Israel, where in the land of Israel and in the Jewish people are observing the Shemitah both there and everywhere. And with that, I would like to offer, it is within the Jewish tradition that we say blessings. We're supposed to say 100 blessings a day. So I offer this blessing for us as we observe this Shemitah, engage in this dialogue together today. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, who makes us holy by observing Shemitah. With blessings, we rest the land, renewing our connection to earth and to each other. With gratitude, we share our abundance and are fulfilled. And with strength, we mend our relationships and obligations, releasing all from bondage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Dr. Laura Novak-Weiner, for leading us in a reminder not only of the land here, but the land that we are all praying for and very, very much concerned about, the land of Ukraine, for all the Ukrainians, for peace in the world, and for all of this. And I do think that what we are studying here with Ched and Elaine are definitely preparing us for the type of justice and peace and true solidarity that we will need to change the world from the model that is being exercised now to a totally different way. Thank you for that. As I introduce our two speakers, Ched Myers and Dr. Elaine Enns, I could refer you to the Interfaith Scholar Weekend website, interfaithscholar.org, for a full biography with all of their writings and so many other resources that they have made available to us. Instead, right now, I'd like to quote them about themselves. I think that letting you know in the first person who they are, it'll help ground what they're going to do with us for the third and fourth presentations, and also clarify everything they've shared in the first two as well. Speaking as Elaine, I would say, all four of my grandparents fled Ukraine and Russia in the 1920s, coming to Saskatchewan with some 22,000 other Mennonite immigrants. During the Russian Revolution and the Civil War, 1917-1921, they and other German speakers endured a continuous climate of violence, plundering, rape, and killing. As a child, I knew something unspeakable had happened to them, but my grandparents spoke only of the good times and the vast abundance and beauty of the land. In my senior year at a Mennonite high school in Saskatchewan, our drama teacher had us perform a Reader's Theater rendition of Barbara Klassen-Smucker's novel, Days of Terror. Survivors of the Jahresheit, a German term loosely translated as a time of being torn apart, spoke with us about their experience. Seeds of a call to become a rememberer in my community were planted in me, which have grown for 30 years. We will see and have seen the fruit of that growth in Elaine over this weekend. Speaking in the first person for Ched Myers, I'll just continue where I left off this morning. I've traveled around North America and abroad in pursuit of a vision, moving among a wide section of faith-based groups and parishes, teaching, listening, challenging, encouraging, and networking. I pursue a holistic pedagogy of theological animation that integrates the disciplines of popular education, evangelism, political organizing, pastoring, and theological reflection. At the center of my approach is the practice of relectura, a rereading of the Bible in the light of concrete struggles against violence and oppression. I believe that the Judeo-Christian sacred story is an older, deeper, and wiser tradition that has the power to transform our lives and our history, but only if we can overcome its domestication under the dominant culture. Our churches, conservative and liberal alike, are often inhospitable to the gospel's invitation to the cross, to solidarity, and to Sabbath economics. Our task is thus to rebuild literacy in which the word and the world are brought to bear on each other at every turn. When and wherever this has happened throughout the history of the church, communities of discipleship, creative celebration, healing, and solidarity with the marginalized have been created or recreated. I want to thank our scholars for what they've done so far, and to thank them for sharing with us how we could join them in this effort. Thank you, Dr. Elaine Enns and Ched Myers. It's your afternoon.
Thank you, Jim. And here at the midpoint, we want to thank all of you for coming back and being with us in our third session. Thanks to all the good folks who have worked cooperatively to pull this ISW together, especially Jim and the ISW committee and our Zoom producers at Fresno State University Ethics Center, which is Ebony today. And thank you to Rabbi Laura for offering our land acknowledgement and our blessing. And also for speaking about Ukraine. As you heard, my grandparents came from there too. So it is a story we carry in our bones. So let's pray for peace. I also want to thank our dear friend, economist Susan Taylor from Just Money Advisors. She is beaming in from Louisville, Kentucky, and she will monitor the chat for this session. We hope that you have stewarded your energy, because now we are really getting to the fun part where the rubber meets the road. To kick off this third session, we want to focus our prophetic women spotlight on New York-based Kadiatu Baldi and Zainab Kohli, who in 2020 founded Faithfully Sustainable. This network curates faith and environmental education, activism, and entrepreneurship, engaging with a community of more than 2,500 members through social media, talks, and fellowship. These two young Muslim women see their efforts as acts of worship that recognize and preserve the mizan, or balance on earth, as a sacred responsibility entrusted by Allah to humans. Their example encourages us to turn our attention now toward the practical aspects of Sabbath economics. In this morning's session, we saw how sociologists Tennies, Polanyi, and Hazel Henderson, each writing about a half century apart, warned about the struggle between the historical forces of community, or what scripture calls manna, and capital, or mammon. These divergent economic stories have been making competing claims on our human hearts, minds, and lives for a very long time. As you've gathered, the premise of this weekend is that our task as people of faith is to ever more consciously and tenaciously recover, nurture, and advocate for community in the midst of the increasingly toxic and predatory power of capital. The reason we front-loaded our scriptural argument is that we know from experience that when we get to the practical stuff, people's resistances start to rise, and someone always objects. What does this have to do with spirituality or religion? So we hope we've made our response to that question clear. Everything. To summarize what we've discussed so far, what is both odd and fatal about the economic story of capital, which is increasingly dominating our culture, is that it has slowly but surely transformed economic exchange and material development from something that was supposed to serve and sustain social relationships to something that now demands the sacrifice of those social relationships to accommodate the growing concentration of wealth and power among the few. One could even argue that in our religious culture, too, profit has replaced prophecy. This trend threatens not only to unravel the remaining fabric of our social relations, it also is already eroding ecological viability, as we noticed last night. For us to survive, this trend must be stopped and reversed. And leaning into that urgent work is surely our vocation as a people of faith, conscience, and justice.
Another straightforward way to summarize our historic dilemma is that of the Earth overshoot model. For many years now, the Global Footprint Network has calculated how many planets we would need to sustain our median lifestyle in the US if it were universally shared. In this infographic, you see that we'd need 5 planets, which we don't have. The GFN also puts it another way, calculate, which is the day that humanity has collectively used up nature's budget for the entire year, and beyond which we are using more resources than the planet can renew. An overshoot day this year for the US was chillingly a week ago, March 13th. In both models, national footprints are vastly unequal globally, so they underline the cruelty of both ecological drawdown and the inherent inequality of our lifestyles. This morning, we focused on 2 aspects of the mammon system that lead to the graves of greed: endemic disparity of class, color, and country on one hand, and our plundering of the Commonwealth on the other. Let's briefly note 3 others that characterize what Benjamin Barber calls McWorld, because they inform our practical work today. One is the steady dispossession of the local by the global, what Daniel Kemmis calls the erosion of market places by placeless markets. Think online shopping. And our resulting alienation from the actual geographical spaces that sustain our lives. A second is the eclipse of use value by exchange value, leading to commodity fetishism. Now, there are 3 terms that all derive from Marx, but they basically mean that things become more valuable than people under pressure from the insatiable power of consumerism, as we'll see in just a moment. And a third characteristic of our is the atrophy of our communal identities and competences under the constant tidal pull of the fantasy of the individual as sovereign producer and consumer. So we've got some serious spiritual and cultural work to do around this economic story if we are going to fully embrace our call to faith and justice. Over the last 2 decades of doing Sabbath economics work in religious communities, we've found that the biggest barrier has been the fact that the media and the message of the mammon narrative are so powerful and so persistent that they simply drown out our older, wiser narratives. In too many ways, we religious folk are more deeply formed by the dominant economic story than by our spiritual convictions and values. We've internalized as sacred and fantasies about, for example, lifting oneself up by one's bootstraps, or how a rising tide putatively raises all boats, or about the innate nobility of upward mobility. But these myths function to demobilize us in two important ways. First, they normalize actual economic disparity and ecological overreach, while socializing every single one of us into this increasing alienation from creation, from community, and from our own core values. And secondly, they persuade us macroeconomic realities are just too complicated for regular folk like us to understand. And we just need to trust the expert managers at the World Bank and the Federal Reserve Board and the Wall Street Journal. But as Professor Sheila Dow puts it, economics has been misrepresented by experts as a technical subject separate from politics and moral judgments. Now, it's true that the economic realities in which we are immersed today are not simple, and they deserve more than sound bites. But the danger of overemphasizing their complexity is that citizens like us become paralyzed from seeking change, convinced that we are mere spectators of a cosmic drama we can neither comprehend nor really engage. Unfortunately, this is indeed the perception of too many of us in our faith communities, which is why we spent much of the first two sessions showing how the stories of Scripture actually put economic practice at the center of religious practice. In order to build social movements for change, we need to help our faith communities recognize how our economic diseases impact our own daily lives and recommit to personal and political action. So our approach here, inspired by the popular education for social transformation approach of the great Brazilian pedagogue Paulo Freire, is to try to make complicated things simple, not simplistic, as in the economic fairy tales we get from politicians and the media, but intelligible enough to engage. Amidst the relentless economic opposition of the priests of the Mammon system, we need to practice the Quaker discipline of speaking plainly. A central adage of popular education is to start with what folk have already experienced. Start with what they know, not with what they don't know. So we'll begin here with the part of the economic story with which we are all most familiar. The Mammon story is broadcast primarily through the culture of consumerism, and advertising is far and away the most powerful and ubiquitous public voice to which urban North Americans are exposed. According to some estimates, the average citizen was exposed to about 500 advertisements every day in the 1970s. Today, those numbers range somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000, depending on where one lives, works, and how much time is spent online. This infographic in front of you is one attempt to map where and how an average working individual is exposed to the myths, fantasies, and imperatives of Madison Avenue every single waking hour of a workday. And we invite you to just study this for a moment, reading from left to right and from top to bottom, and let that number sink in. Over 5,000 times every day, the Mammon story is reinforced. And Jim Grant was so excited that he got to study Scripture twice today. And while you're studying this chart, let a commercial jingle or a tagline pop into your head. How about, like a good neighbor, State Farm is there? A classic instance of capital colonizing community. Are those jingles starting to circle through your mind? Those taglines? Look at the landscape of colonization by capital.
That's it. The tragic truth is the economic story that is beaming at us 24/7 through advertising and social media has a compelling plot. In order to grab and hold our attention, ad sound bites recruit us in a twofold drama. On one hand, they narrate what we might call, in classic theater terms, the comedy of our desires. And on the other hand, they prey upon the tragedy of our anxieties. These are perhaps the two most powerful human emotions, which is why a seminal 1997 film analyzed this phenomenon as the ad and the ego. Let's take two innocuous automobile ads as examples to see how these narratives colonize and deform us. Here's a very postmodern ad with a bigger than life glistening image and a simple tagline. It clearly exploits a consumer's desire for self-assertion and freedom, which somehow this Mustang automobile promises. But wait, there's more. Because the tagline alludes to an older, wiser story. The 19th century American poet Emma Lazarus is best remembered for her sonnet, The New Colossus, whose words, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." These are inscribed on the Statue of Liberty. This is an American sacred text, but here, cynically, it's used to sell cars. This is an example of what we mean when we talk about the Commonwealth. In this case, a cultural treasure being sacrificed to capital. And in this case, put into the service of fantasies of desire, not so innocuous. And here's the other side of the coin. A different car ad that plays on our anxieties. We all know we can die in a car crash, though we drive every day. And in the back of our mind, we worry about whether our vehicle is safe enough. To solve this problem, Toyota assures us that they've attended to the details, thus rescuing us. Anxiety created, anxiety relieved by buying this automobile. Here's another example, just as close to home for some of you. Financial planning services. In this case, you get three images of desire that are typical among upper middle class income people looking to retire. The enjoyment of grandkids, the endless fishing trips, and the old guy still being able to surf. That one is targeting Ched. Now, here's the anxiety-producing alternative. Oh, there are so many risks to retirement, and these guys can help you avoid them. So you can end up on your own yacht, covering the desire base as well. Genius. Of course, anything can be sold by manipulating male desire and anxiety, from perfume to beer. But when seductive fantasies are beamed at you 5,000 times a day, it begins to create credulity in us, which in turn renders us infantilized and alienated from what is real. It is a process of incremental dehumanization, relentlessly turning a proletariat into a consumeriat. Even something as mundane as mouthwash can be marketed through anxiety, a strategy that goes back to the dawn of the advertising industry and which still works today. The origins of the modern advertising industry lay in the economic crisis of relative consumer satiation in America during the 1920s. That was the point in early industrial mass production in which most folks who wanted manufactured durable goods had bought them. So the market flattened because needs were fulfilled. But profits are based on growth curves. So advertising pivoted from focusing on giving information about a project to spinning magical tales, narrating its putative ability to bring salvation or happiness. This would motivate consumers to buy stuff they didn't actually need, and thus keep markets growing. To do this, advertising concentrated on preying on human desire and anxiety, especially targeting patriarchal stereotypes, whether keyed to the Leave It to Beaver 1950s or to today. But imputing to a thing power to give us happiness not only alienates our true emotions and values, it also functions to obscure the actual material contents of the thing and the realities of its production, especially under oppressive conditions, as is the case of diamonds. See the miner in the shadows? That is why Marx called it commodity fetishism. He was already anticipating how mystical fantasies about manufactured things would displace consciousness about who and how the thing was made. But long before Marx, in the Abrahamic tradition from Moses to Muhammad, idolatry, or shirk, was defined as our human penchant for turning the works of our own hands into magical beings, with whom we then assume a relationship of servitude, as classically articulated in Isaiah 44. We too today look more to material things than to the liberator God for our salvation. And now people or social influence is being fetishized, as you see in this ad, by an ad agency for its advertising prowess through social media, which places style, why you do it, over substance, what you do. It's capital cannibalizing community for profit, generating followers in the way religion used to do. Ads have an evil genius to distract us from and twist what's important. Here's a third automobile-related ad. They really are the Rorschach test of modern industrial culture. Again, this postmodern image makes you have to think before you realize that it's a tire ad. This image projects both desire, the omnipotence of off-roading through wild landscapes, and anxiety. Your vehicle will dominate any potential threat by wild animals. But the subtext is downright malevolent. It celebrates how human domination interrupts the chain of life in nature for our own short-term gratification. It valorizes a pathology in the service of selling tires. These are truly images that speak 1,000 words, illustrating how the world of mammon plunders the world of manna.
Let's broaden out our analysis. Desire, anxiety, and distraction conspire to shape into a consummariat nation in which our collective desire for more, both as households and as a culture, in turn generates anxiety, driving a cycle of doubt that there will ever be enough, because we've been persuaded that the artificial abundance of the few and the artificial scarcity of the many are both natural conditions, not socially engineered ones, of dissatisfaction, because the constant seduction of more, better, newer socializes us to hold in contempt mere sufficiency, and the resulting pandemic of deficit spending, both personally and politically, as our usurious credit economy fuels debt accumulation, which generates more anxiety. Meantime, portrays anxiety and desire also distract us from the real story of what is happening to our planet and to our souls. It's a vicious cycle, friends, and one which we each and all know only too intimately in our own bones. We are all children of this culture. So this image captures poignantly, we think, our dilemma as a culture beholden to mammon. It portrays our captivity to bipolar swings of manic grandiosity on one hand and terrified depression on the other. There's that dialectic of desire and anxiety again. This disease prevents us from slowing down our drive toward climate disaster and its related social crises. The careening automobile is the perfect symbol of a market economy upon which we all depend and into which we're all deeply entwined. An economy predicated upon the consumption of fossil fuels and material growth at all costs. We imagine the guy on the phone in the bottom right-hand corner trying to call for help, but otherwise a powerless spectator. He kind of tragically symbolizes our religious communities. But you know what, friends? That's not good enough. Our vocation as people of faith is to call ourselves and others to slow and stop this dysfunctional joyride before it's too late. One more time, Wendell Berry, this as the addict's excuse, the conviction that we cannot change because we are dependent upon what is wrong. But siblings in the faith, the addict's excuse will not do. We use the term public addiction because compulsions such as the ones named on this slide, though they have many of the same characteristics of personal addiction, are actually recognized by our economic culture. So particularly for the professional classes, limitless growth, accumulation, material preoccupations, and boundaryless work, these are not only encouraged, they're often rewarded with more of the addictive activity. So here we desperately need the wisdom of the addiction recovery movement, which is the fastest growing grassroots spiritual practice in the US today, and which is hosted by many of your congregational buildings. Sabbath Economics is a recovery program for both personal and public addiction to the mammon economy. We call it household covenant work, and this will be the focus of the rest of this session. But first, one more word about our theory of change, the big picture. There are many tasks in what we call the jigsaw puzzle of changing ourselves and the world. The following four are essential: critical literacy in the problems we face, and imagineering of alternatives. So we devoted most of our presentations up until now to that important work. Secondly, engaging the patterns and structures that are perpetuating the problems by becoming empowered and effective advocates and organizers who both oppose toxic systems and support healing and reconstruction, right? So we're starting in the top left corner and working clockwise. Third, building cultures that reform institutions or build alternative ones to bring systemic change. And finally, in the meantime, while we're doing all of that, changing our own household habits to become the change we want to see. There's Gandhi again. These are not sequential aspects, but simultaneous and indeed cyclical ones, a life journey of transformation, and each is important. We can work the puzzle from any corner, but ultimately we must address them all. Let us try to illustrate this with a simple, concrete example. Worried about plastics in the environment? Well, if not, you should be, because our waste plastic is colonizing both the largest terrains on Earth, as in the plastic gyre the size of Texas in the Pacific Ocean, as well as the most intimate spaces, microplastics ingested into our body. And the plastic waste stream problem has intensified through the COVID pandemic, as you know. So education makes us aware of what's often not visible to us in our daily lives. An example of organizing might be to change consumer patterns by getting cities to ban the sale of single-use plastic bags, We helped our little town of Ojai to become the first city in California to do this several years ago. An example of building alternatives might be to change policy statewide to mandating sustainable surrogates for plastics, such as biodegradable or durable material made out of renewable resources, while watchdogging the plastics industry and rewarding recycling markets. All of these things are going on today. And while we're working on all this, we change our own bad habits at home as a necessary, if not by itself sufficient, aspect of change. Doing this keeps us mindful every day of the larger work that remains in the other areas. So in the following conversation, we're going to focus on the left-hand quadrant. And we do that in the conviction that for all of us, this is where the big systemic issues of addiction intersect most concretely with our daily lived existence. So it's a good place to engage recovery work. So let's, as you contemplate this, let's take our 1 minute chair yoga break. Take a deep breath, because we're about to dive in.
1 minute, friends, and we'll start it back up. All right, friends. 15 years ago, our cooperative developed what we call a household Sabbath economics covenant that focuses on the realm of personal and family finances and lifestyle. This process invites and challenges us into a kind of stepped recovery process, committing to at least one specific commitment we can make in each of 7 areas annually, and then deepening our commitment for the next year. As in 12-step wisdom, recovery is not a private journey. It requires a community of others on the journey for support and accountability. Such groups help us to brainstorm realistic and creative steps for ourselves, as well as to make and sustain our commitments. This is not a process for spectators or for experts. We all have an economic story. We all inhabit places in this economy as workers and consumers, and we are all caught in addictive, compulsive habits that are diminishing us and the planet. Most importantly, sharing our stories helps us break our silence and sense of powerlessness around economic issues. It functions to deprivatize our anxieties as we realize others struggle with the same stuff. And at the same time, it communitizes our imaginations, leading to creative, personal, and collective responses. As in all recovery work, the focus is on how we take our first step, or our next step. And if it's a little cliche, that's only because Lao Tzu's wisdom has been around for such a long time. Only the next step can take us on a lifetime journey. Our Sabbath economics mantra is this: no step of change we take is too small, and at the same time, given the crisis we're dealing with, no step is too big either. So as we review our covenantal model with you now, we invite you to be thinking as concretely as you can, what are your next steps in Sabbath economics recovery? And we always have to remind progressively minded folks that virtue signaling doesn't really help anyone. It's vulnerability that does. We are not interested in what any of us are already doing, but about how we can each and all go deeper. Of course, our model had to be shaped around 7 areas because it's Sabbath economics, but they aren't arbitrary. We think they broadly cover most of the major aspects of household economics. So let's walk through them briefly. And as we go, we'll take a series of, again, anonymous polls to give us a sense of our similarities and differences. This is an opportunity to do some self-examination, as they say in 12-step work. Honest self-assessment is the antidote to denial. We give our attention to 3 basic money practices: how we handle our surplus capital, our negative capital or our debt, and our giving and sharing. Why? Because these are the primary loci of desire and anxiety in our society. They call it capitalism for a reason. Before we wade into this subject, we always like to recognize that there are huge class and cultural taboos about whether and how and to whom we should talk about money. A couple of years ago, Ella Murdoch Gardner of The Money Muse wrote, "As children, many Americans are taught that it's rude or inappropriate to discuss money. This social norm carries into adulthood, and most people avoid the subject without even fully understanding why." A recent study by Capital Group shows that Americans are more comfortable talking to friends about mental health, addiction, marital discord, politics, religion, and even sex than money. But let's be clear. Our dysfunctional economic system depends on us keeping silent about its single most important aspect. So to help us break our silence about this delicate and explosive subject, we like to offer this comforting and hopeful money image. It's just a bunch of small change. As we'll reiterate throughout this work, we work our way up to major changes by making small ones. So, a good place to dive in is with a money autobiography, a discipline that was pioneered by Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C., and which is now used by most mainstream Christian denominations. And we recommend the resources at Faith and Money Network if you're interested in exploring this practice. Part of this step involves estimating one's household net worth. In our small groups, we encourage folks to share that number, anonymously usually, because of the taboos as well as the undue shame or sometimes pride around these issues. This is a powerful way of breaking silence, and it's often quite revelatory. We'll do this in a minute through an anonymous poll. But first,
a reminder that calculating financial assets are not just about how much one has in one's bank account. It's an aggregate of land, labor, and capital-based assets. So a quick word about each, and as we go, we'll point out the aspects of the disparity system we've been talking about all weekend. First, in the homeowning class, one from which more than 1/3 of all Americans are excluded, by the way, this means calculating our equity in land and fixed assets, houses, cars, rental units, etc. But did you know that almost a third of American households have zero or negative net wealth apart from the asset of their home. Second, for working Americans, which again is not everybody, it means considering one's salary or paycheck, as well as the value of any workplace-based assets, retirement, Social Security accounts, consultancies, and even moonlighting economic activity. Here again, keep in mind the racial disparities of and underemployment in our country. And third, capital is represented by savings accounts, investments, securities, minus debt, which is what we'll talk about next. Not so fun fact. Though a little more than half of adult Americans claim to have some investment in the stock market, the Federal Reserve reports that the richest 10% now own almost 90% of the stock market's value, a record high. And the richest 1% hold over half the stocks and mutual funds owned by households. As you now complete the surplus capital poll, which Ebony is going to put up. And these are quick exercises, just about a minute. Remember the big picture. 10% of American households own 70% of American wealth. And that 10% likely includes none of us on this Zoom call. So go ahead and take a minute to do this poll.
Ebony, where are we at in terms of folks participating?
So it's about 65%.
Okay, friends, we'll give about 30 more seconds. So please try to get some answers in there. Okay, Ebony, why don't you show us the aggregate results?
Okay, so this gives us just a very quick glimpse of us as an economic community. And we're spread out across those rather arbitrary sectors that we talked about. The reason for the following questions, and thanks for doing that first part. We know that's maybe a little bit like getting a root canal, but that's what we're trying to do here, is break silence. It's interesting that more than half of us are still at corporate banks, and so that's something we'd like to see change.
The credit union, though, I remember that was my first experience in Fresno, was being able to be a part of that Fresno credit union. And I know FDU still supports banking there.
All right, so about 2/3 to 1/3 having investments or not. That's partly the result of the demographics we looked at earlier. And here's an interesting, the fourth question was about socially responsible or community development funds. We'll talk about that right now. And we've still got 2/3 of us who are in conventional investments. So thanks. Ebony, go ahead and close that poll, and we will talk a little bit about this work. Because for people of faith and values, the question of whether our banked or invested money is building capital or a community should be more important than what our financial return is. Because money is not morally neutral, nor are its uses. That's true for banking or investments. Still, probably all of us have surplus capital of some kind, whether it's a little something something stuffed under the mattress or full-fledged investment accounts. So let's concentrate on this key question. How can Sabbath economics help us bend such assets more in the direction of community, even as we organize to change the bigger structures that reinforce disparity? So an important question is how and where we bank. Moving from large anonymous corporate banks to more locally capitalized and owned banks, or better yet, credit unions with a social mission is, we think, a really important and even fundamental step. Because the issue of surplus capital is this: are we just making money on money through the usury system, or are we making our surplus available to those who are marginalized precisely because they do not have access to capital? Usury or interest has, of course, been roundly denounced by all three Abrahamic traditions, yet continues to thrive as the backbone of our economic system. Islamic banking takes prohibitions on usury more seriously than do their religious cousins. And over the last 20 years, there's been a renaissance in what's called riba-free or interest-free banking in these communities. It's based more on a shared risk and social contract form of lending. An economic transaction is considered riba-free if it avoids multiplier mode of money-making, profit-taking, and capital creation. This approach is based on Sharia law, in which labor is considered more valuable than money. And it's a model, we think, from which the rest of us could learn. Perhaps one of you knows whether there are riba-free banks in Fresno. And if we invest, where and on whose behalf? There are three main strategies for socially responsible investing. One focuses on screening investments to ensure that we're not capitalizing business practices which we would not approve of, i.e. sweatshops, corporate polluting, or the arms industry. A second strategy organizes shareholder activism to advocate for corporate accountability, including shareholder actions at banks to protest, for example, predatory lending. And a third, which in our opinion is the best approach, is community investing. And here we want to shout out to our friends at Just Money Advisors who have opened up this world to us, who are deeply committed to Sabbath economics and who are one of the best sources for information on social and community investing. The definition of poverty in the US is not a lack of money, but rather a lack of access to capital and equity. Community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, direct capital from investors to communities underserved by traditional banks to provide access to services these communities would otherwise not have. Community investing also supports green businesses and social entrepreneurship at home and abroad. There are lots of ways to help folks move money for change. A campaign we conducted 15 years ago with a Southern California presbytery involved working with only 50 households who collectively moved tens of millions of dollars in savings and investments into CDFIs. All it took was attention and education and organizing.
The flip side of surplus capital is negative capital or debt. This is hard to escape, and it's where the usury system really rules. The advent of easy credit in our consumer economy has resulted in epidemic debt and household bankruptcy. Alex Wallenwein wrote in 2004, "Debt-based fiat money is the economic equivalent of heroin." Whether we're talking about the federal deficit or the instant buying power of credit cards, we might call easy credit the desire side of the mammon cycle and the resulting debt, the anxiety side. So, Evany, let's take another quick poll. the negative capital poll to map out some of this terrain for us.
And again, we know that some of you could check multiple boxes, but the poll doesn't allow us to do that. So just check the box that is most significant for you.
For this poll, it's actually multiple choice.
Oh, can they actually select more
Yeah.
than one?
Oh, sorry.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ebony. You're doing a great job.
As of right now, 60% have participated.
Okay.
Let's give it about 15 more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll and see our results. So really interesting statistics. Little bit surprising that almost a third of us have no debt. That's pretty unique. What is equally significant here in the result is that almost a quarter of us are dealing with debt over $100,000, which is significant. So debt is a big issue. It is something that tends to domesticate us personally and politically. You can close the poll. Thank you, Ebony. You're doing great. So some of the strategies that we often recommend is begin using a credit card condom, right? Just something you stick on your credit card that helps you think twice or think thrice about whether you really need something. Now, we've been pushing credit card condoms and using them for about 15 years. And in preparing this talk, I went to Google credit card condoms to get a better image than the one that we were using 15 years ago. Not a single image of what we mean by credit card condom. There are credit cards that you can get that will give you a discount on condoms, but there is no such thing anymore on the web of a credit card condom, i.e. something you slip over your credit card, which is scary because it indicates how powerful the credit industry is in erasing alternative or dissident voices. Limiting yourself to one credit card is a good strategy. Using savings to pay off percentage of your debt. These are actually just kind of responsible financial planning. But the last issue, Elaine, I think you want to talk a little bit about because it's really, really cool, which is debt collectives and debt relief movements.
Yeah. Student debt has become a widespread crisis of disparity and paralysis for tertiary education. And there's an interesting contemporary movement called the Debt Collective. Organizer Hannah Appel says their strategy is based upon a crucial political truism. She says, alone, our student debts are a burden, but together, organized, they make us powerful, giving us leverage over systems that exploit us. So students, they are planning an action this coming April 4th at the Department of Education to urge the Biden administration to fulfill a campaign promise to cancel student debt before federal student loan payments restart in May. This kind of organizing is having an impact on national policy. A different kind of communitizing is illustrated by Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia, which paid off $100,000 in student debt for 34 Howard University students, using funds raised in the course of a month-long financial fast by church members in 2019. These are old school strategies of economics for the Black church, and we should all learn from them too. Our giving is one of the surviving practices of the old love economy. Charitable giving prioritizes social relations before private capital accumulation. But our household giving isn't always strategic, consistent, or well organized. So it's good to review our history and values around our personal giving, particularly assessing what relationships we have with those to whom we give. Speaking from our experience as a small community-supported nonprofit organization, we can testify that relational giving is not only more satisfying, but also more sustainable and reliable. And it's way better than writing a check in hopes that that issue will go away. So, Ebony, can you run the giving poll?
We're at 58%.
Thanks, Ebony.
Thanks,
Give me
Ebony.
about 15 more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll and show results. Okay, so we're good on charitable giving. We haven't experimented much with collectivizing. I know that's scary because that de-individualizes things, but it's actually a magnificent spiritual discipline and something that religious congregations can experiment with because you've got a relational network of people that you trust. What's really encouraging is that 3/4 of you are in close relationship with organizations to whom you donate. We think that's really an important aspect, is relational giving and relational support. Okay, go ahead and close the poll. Thank you, Ebony.
Yeah, and Arrington raised this question earlier. How does our giving contribute to social transformation, or is it just convenient charity facilitated by the nonprofit industrial complex? As 18th century English writer, philosopher, and advocate of women's rights, Mary Wollstonecraft put it, there's far more charity than justice in our world. And that's an argument for giving strategically as well as relationally. We've run other experiments in the past in which individual donors formed giving collectives where they discussed and decided on joint charitable donations, which have made a bigger impact. To summarize the 3 money steps, we can't use our money merely as a tool for increasing gratification and expect that the social networks we want and need will flourish. This is the central contradiction in our culture today. Values and relationships are in fact the glue of society, of democracy, and certainly of our faith. So we now want to take a quick look at the household covenant's 4 lifestyle steps and the equally challenging struggle with addiction and entitlement. Environmental issues are probably the one area of social concern that has made significant traction among religious communities over the last quarter century, though obviously not enough to make a difference in our historical trajectory as a civilization, at least not yet. Now here, let's celebrate the passion of our Sikh siblings. Since 2010, EcoSikh has been engaging Sikhs to take action on nature preservation and to combat the threat of the climate change. Earlier this week, March 14th was celebrated around the globe as World Sikh Environment Day, during which Sikhs hosted nature walks, bicycle rallies, installed solar panels in gurdwaras, prepared organic langar, and gave seminar on nature themes. This year spread awareness about the life of the seventh Sikh master, Sri Guru Har Raji, who devoted his life to the protection of flora and fauna. The question of this fourth step is, what can we do to make our households and lifestyles significantly greener? So Ebony, please run our green living poll. This poll asks, what is one new practice you would like to explore in each of these different green living sections?
We're at about 56%.
Thanks, Ebony. Let's take about 30 more seconds. Ebony, where are we at?
We are at 70%.
Great, let's call it. Thank you. Nice. I'm giggling at that first one, 70% changing to biodiesel. Or electric. That we are at biodiesel, which took us a long time to go, and now we are trying to get to electric, and it has taken us much longer than we hoped to. So, and it's wonderful to realize that when we drive our car, we are not using fossil fuels. So we just encourage all of you that are interested in that next step to explore it. And we're excited to see the solar one as well. That took us a long time, and we just did it 10 months ago. And boy, that is really fun when your bill is negative. Coming in for us here from SoCal Edison. But all of these that the practices here make such a huge difference. Yes, and then the water and food practices, water catchment for those of us living in Southern California or Central California, so central for us to be working on, and such a delight to be able to use water that has been gathered on your yard. And there's also nothing more delicious than eating locally grown food. So thank you. And this is the fun when we can imagine what we want to do next. And what is important is to do this in community so that next year when you gather the commitments you have made, you are questioned and encouraged to keep those commitments. There's so many amazing sustainability practices being pioneered. Yeah, thank you, Ebony, if you want to close the poll there. It is hard to keep up. And really, there's no excuse for us not to be engaging as many of them as we can. Remember the lesson of overshoot. Our ecological footprint is too big because there is only one planet. And remember the lesson of plastic bags. So altering our personal habits won't in itself change systems and structures, but mindful habits are essential to remaining conscious of the problems we face and for training us, again, as Gandhi used to say, to become the change we want to see in the world. We are the most wasteful nation on earth. Our addiction to more than we need becomes the graves of greed for poor people and the planet. So we all need to take regular, fearless moral inventories, as the 12 steppers say, regarding issues of household addictions and make concrete commitments for recovery with measurable goals. So here comes another poll. Ebony, could you run the consumption poll? Now, for the second question, find the easiest label of something you're wearing and try to look at it and indicate on the poll where it was made.
Fifteen more seconds, Ebony, and then we'll see what we got. Although, actually, we better give it maybe 20 more because people are fumbling with their clothes right now.
Yeah, right now we're at 55%.
Okay, let's give it about 20 more seconds. Okay, let's call it. Yeah, so interesting on doing the label thing. We just had an exercise where you did it, and what that showed is, wow, 70% made in Asia. Right, so this is the kind of issue where we realize that the global economy is as close as the clothes on our back. And that's got to make us care about just working conditions, just materials.
I've been the most rigorous.
Yeah, okay. So as far as the reuse, recycle, repurpose, there's room for improvement for all of us. But we're getting there. So this is all about our next steps. Thanks so much, Ebony. You can close the poll.
There are so many goals we can set for ourselves, again, as an exercise over powerlessness, of mindfulness, and of creative engagement. Unaccountable consumption is not an entitlement, though we mostly live as if it is. Just as it is important to learn our watersheds, we also need to become literate in our waste shed. Not the old-timey one with the moon on it, but the map of where your trash and wastewater and even your recyclables end up. We've taken tours of both our county trash and recycling operations and the wastewater plant here, and it was very interesting. So we encourage both public and private firms to make changes by advocacy. It's crucial that we don't overlook this sixth step. Ultimately, we won't truly understand the cruelty of too muchness until we see the ravages of not enoughness. And the footprints of disparity and marginalization and poverty are everywhere around us if we have eyes to see. Oxfam issues annual reports on the cost of global inequality if we need a refresher. Solidarity is about building relationships across the gulf of our ignorance, insulation, and privilege, not so much for the other community's liberation as for our own. Ebony, please run the solidarity poll. Now, this poll keys on questions of class and poverty.
We're at about 52%.
Okay, let's give it about 30 more seconds.
Okay, it's been about 30 seconds. 64 have participated.
Oh, wonderful, thank you.
Great, let's go ahead and call it.
Hey, thank you, friends. You are doing an awesome job participating.
Lightning polls.
Well, and 64 out of 69 is really, really great. Okay, so we have about a 50% participation in trade unions and almost the same in labor actions. Yeah, you have immersed yourself in a community, 82% of us, which we'll talk about that in a moment, but that is one of the most important things. It's interesting to me that, yeah, 40% of us that identify as women have experienced being paid less. Sometimes in other polls that has been much higher. So maybe we are making some progress in that. When it comes to solidarity, there's no substitute for showing up. Learning the issues of disparity is good, but the best way to metabolize that knowledge is our bodies in spaces where folks are struggling, in both senses of that verb, fighting to survive and fighting to overcome. Seeing for ourselves is a powerful strategy for transformation, but also a privilege. Congregations that do mission trips should always make sure these are about justice, not charity or poverty tourism. The goal of solidarity is to establish ongoing relationships, preferably ones in which we are supporting the lead communities in the struggle.
We're mindful of the time, but we are going to do this last. It's a little ironic that the last step is about Sabbath, the keystone principle of the whole covenant. Truth be told, I always kind of hoping we run out of time before tackling this one, because as a workaholic, I suck at getting and keeping good boundaries on work. Seriously, as a Mennonite, there's an effect from the work system that I do from the culture of work. It's my most difficult recovery practice, and I desperately need the ancient wisdom of Genesis 2, in which the creation narrative flips the script of modernity. Work here is a noun, and rest is the verb. Stopping, limiting, resting, all ways of being rather than doing. So here comes our last poll. Go ahead and run the Sabbath poll, Ebony. Okay, Ebony, let's go ahead and close that poll. The even spread on the work, but also on the upper end, not so good. Interesting that there's almost as those moving online are almost as many working more as working less. 3/4 of us, friends, do not have a weekly power down period. So we've got lots of work to do, and we know it's very, very challenging to do. Some of the things you like to do in your recreation. So thanks, Ebony. Great job on the polls.
Yeah,
Great job,
thank you,
everybody,
Ebony.
doing these lightning polls. We
Yes.
know that we're moving kind of quickly, but these are same things. Spiritual practices are key to Sabbath, and mindfulness meditation is something Buddhists tend to practice much better than most of the rest of us, which gives us an opportunity to honor one of the great apostles of this tradition in the West, the recently departed Thich Nhat Hanh, whose life was a witness to inner and outer peace. It's our impression that younger activists are generally more aware than was our generation of how important spiritual practices of renewal are in the work of social change. But it's hard to sustain such practices individually. Actually, it's impossible, which is why the tradition of Sabbath is irreducibly communal. We're collaborating with the Green Sabbath Project, a Jewish renewal effort that is offering to help the rest of us recognize and embrace the power of a weekly day of rest. Like every other step in the household covenant, the more we practice these disciplines, the stronger we will be and the more impact those practices will have socially. Remember, well, actually, let me stop there and ask Susan Taylor, who's been patiently waiting for us to finish so she could field questions and comments. We obviously don't have a lot of time for that, Susan, but what are your impressions? Can you give us a couple of minutes of what you're seeing in the chat and in the comments?
One question, if you've got a minute, is an anonymous attendee said they're grappling with the question of buying goods made in different parts of the world. because our clothes employ thousands in different parts of the world. So what wisdom do you have to offer to those who will be unemployed? Maybe the goal should be to make sure all are treated well and fairly.
Yeah, it's a little bit like the money question. We all handle this stuff. We're all dealing with clothing and other things made in all kinds of circumstances. Changing our habits of consumption, withdrawing from places that we know where there's exploitation, getting involved, kind of like shareholder advocacy. There have been big campaigns around Nike, for example, over the years to get them to lose their sweatshop practices and get fair wages, renewable materials. So it's all about engagement. It's never about giving up because it's too complicated. It's about trying to be mindful and keep pressing to find. And that's why reading those labels and then going behind the labels to see what's actually happening is really important.
Thank you. The chat was fairly minimal, but it's clear that a number of people have been thinking about aspects of this work for a long time in various ways. So that was whether it's electric vehicles, had an idea for a credit card condom. They'd already thought that through. Asking questions about denominational pension programs and social investing. So those were the kinds of sharing that the chat pulled up. Thanks for everyone who participated in that.
And thank you, Susan, for keeping your eyes on the chat and for all you have done to help us along this way. Susan is actually working on a new edition of the Practical Household Covenant workbook, and we look forward to that coming out sometime this year.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Susan.
You bet.
Remember last night how we saw that Exodus 16 exhorted the Israelites to keep a jar of manna in front of the altar to remember the covenant of Sabbath economics for all generations, and how we lamented that this jar must have gotten lost somewhere along the way. Or maybe it's locked down in a storage basement in Washington, D.C., like the Lost Ark in the Indiana Jones film. Well, we have a friend in Northern California who, after embracing the Sabbath economics program, began making these jars, which we think is kind of cool. We have one on our home altar as a reminder. So we got the jar. All we have to do now is rediscover the manna. And that is our work. We want to close this session by reiterating that if any of you are inspired to pursue this kind of household covenant work in earnest, we warmly commend our friends at Faith and Money Network in Washington, D.C., which is specifically set up to curate spaces and support folks on the journey of Sabbath economics. So if any of you write us and say, we want to do Sabbath economics work, we'll send you straight to Faith and Money Network. Their director, Mike Little, told me this week that they've got 3 or 4 spots left on their next in their next covenant group. So if you're interested, please contact them and mention our names. And finally, we've just revised our little booklet summarizing and popular place for Sabbath economics. It's available as a PDF. Just email Chris at Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries, and he'll hook you up for just $5. Such a deal. So we know we worked through a lot of material, did it very quickly. We're a little over our time. So we're going to thank you all for terrific work today, and really hope you come back for our last round tomorrow, where we're going to delve into another profound vector of this work. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Susan, Jim, and all for being with us. And
Rabbi Laura, thank you. And we'll see you tomorrow at 1 o'clock Pacific Daylight Time. Thank you all.
Have a good rest of your day.